If you agree that true courage isn't measured in the medals people see, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story proves that silence often hides the fiercest warriors. It began with a box no one expected to matter. A supply clerk at Fort Meriden had been cleaning out an old footlocker after rotation drills when he found it wedged beneath a broken cot in the storage bay. Dust covered the surface, the hinges rusted stiff, but when he forced it open, what lay inside turned the entire barracks quiet. Medals no one there had ever seen before, a commendation folded into brittle paper, and at the bottom, a letter signed by a general, its ink faded but unmistakable. The name on the envelope was one that only a handful of older soldiers recognized. Harlow. Not a man's name. Lena Harlow. And as the whispers spread, the story everyone thought they understood about this smoke girl began to fracture. Before that box was opened, Sergeant Lena Harlow, late 20s, sharp-eyed and silent, had been little more than background noise to most of the unit. She was the one with the smoke canisters strapped to her vest, the one who slipped quietly into drills without demanding attention, the one whose boots were always caked in training mud because she stayed behind longer than anyone else to double-check perimeter markers. Recruits joked that she was half soldier, half stagehand, as if the canisters she carried were props in a show rather than tools in a war. They laughed that she was training to be the military smoke machine, not a warrior. Some even whispered she had slipped through the cracks, a sympathy case promoted only because someone felt sorry for her. She never corrected them. She just lit her canisters, pulled the cord, and let the smoke curl around her until their words faded into the gray. What they didn't know was that the call sign buried in that letter, Sentinel Wolf, wasn't just ink on a page. It was a title earned years earlier in a place none of them had ever dared to imagine. A title forged in the choking dust of an ambush, where every second meant life or death. But here, at Fort Meriden, in the safety of drills and simulated engagements, Lena remained quiet. She rose before dawn, her hair tied back in the same rough braid, boots laced so tight they left lines on her ankles, and walked to the training yard without complaint. She carried smoke grenades like others carried rifles, and for that, she was invisible. Until one autumn morning, standing in the chalk-lined dirt, she became the subject of their ridicule once more. Lieutenant Marlowe, a new officer eager to prove himself, smirked at the sight of her pack bulging with canisters. "There goes our personal fog machine," he said loud enough for the recruits to hear. "If the enemy ever needs a concert entrance, we've got it covered." Laughter rippled through the line. Lena's gaze didn't shift. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead, as if the joke had missed her entirely. But a younger corporal near the back of the group, Reyes, barely 23, watched her differently. He had seen the way she moved in past drills, the way her timing with smoke wasn't random but precise, layered, deliberate. He didn't laugh, but he didn't speak either, because silence was easier than standing against the tide. And so the image stuck. Lena, the smoke girl, too young to be a legend, too strange to be taken seriously. What none of them knew was that her silence wasn't surrender. It was memory. Memory of the night in the desert when she had been 21, fresh-faced and terrified, handed the call sign, Sentinel Wolf, by a commander who didn't waste words. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, pinned against the ridgeline. Retreat was the only option. And it was Lena, just Lena then, who had volunteered to cover them, striking canister after canister until the stars themselves disappeared behind a curtain of shifting gray. She had walked into the smoke while others fled through it, staying long enough that the enemy never saw where the line ended, never knew when to fire, never realized they were already gone. That night, a corporal had saluted her in the smoke, whispering the call sign like an oath. Sentinel Wolf, cover the retreat. It was a story sealed in classified reports, whispered only among those who had lived it. To everyone else, she was still the quiet girl with smoke in her hands. And as part one of her story closes, we find her standing on that autumn field, recruits laughing, officers smirking, her boots planted in dirt that had forgotten more names than it remembered. She didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She simply pulled one canister free, tested its weight in her palm, and looked toward the horizon. Because she knew the day would come when smoke would no longer be a joke, when silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. And when that day arrived, they would learn what Sentinel Wolf truly meant. The morning of the exercise began with a chill in the air, fog stretching low across the training grounds. The kind of fog that seemed to creep into the bones of even the most seasoned recruits, carrying with it a sense of unease that no amount of bravado could disguise. Soldiers lined up shoulder to shoulder, rifles slung, their chatter low, their nervous laughter brittle, clinging to routine in hopes of steadying their hearts. For them, this was just another drill, another exercise stamped into the endless cycle of training days at Fort Meriden. But for Lena Harlow, it was something else entirely. She stood apart, quiet as always, her pack weighed down with smoke canisters that had long made her the butt of barracks jokes. Her boots were planted firmly in the dirt, her braid tucked neatly under her helmet, eyes sweeping the tree-line not with anxiety, but with the same calm vigilance that had carried her through darker nights years ago. Around her, the whispers rose like gnats. "There she is, the fog machine," one recruit muttered. "Wonder if she practices for raves on the weekends." Another chuckled. "Nah, she probably thinks smoke wins wars." Their laughter stung only because it was careless, unthinking. She didn't flinch. She never did. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her pack, let the voices drift away, and fixed her attention on the horizon where the fog pooled thick and heavy, hiding secrets no one else could see. Then the first crack shattered the morning stillness. A thunderclap of blank rounds from the tree-line, echoing across the training field with a violence that felt too real for simulation. The recruits jolted as if slapped, their half-formed discipline collapsing in an instant. Some dropped flat onto their stomachs. Others broke ranks entirely, sprinting in jagged lines toward the safety of the barracks wall. Shouts erupted, commands colliding like clashing cymbals, lieutenants screaming for order, sergeants barking contradictory instructions, no one's voice rising above the storm. The chaos fed itself, panic blossoming in the fog like wildfire. But amid the scrambling bodies, Lena moved with a strange calmness, a steadiness that didn't belong in drills. Her hands worked with practiced ease, sliding a smoke grenade from her pack, pin pulled with a flick, arm arcing high as the canister soared and landed in the dirt with a hiss. Smoke billowed immediately, thick, curling upward into the fog, blurring the outlines of retreating soldiers. She didn't hesitate. Another canister rolled from her grip, then another, each placed not randomly but deliberately, angled to create corridors, layers, patterns invisible to the untrained eye. To the recruits, it looked frantic, like she was hiding behind her beloved smoke, desperate to mask her fear. But there was no fear in the way she moved. Her shoulders stayed squared, her steps measured, her breathing steady, like she'd been here before. Because she had. She had walked into fire and pulled a curtain of smoke between life and death once before, and the rhythm of it lived in her body still. She motioned to a cluster of recruits huddled against the open field, gesturing sharply toward the cover she'd built. They hesitated, confused, until the smoke curled thicker, concealing their retreat. Slowly, they crawled, then stumbled into safety, their escape masked by her work. Still, the others laughed under their breath, dismissing her as obsessive. They didn't understand the geometry of her actions, the precision behind every plume of gray. They didn't see that what looked like chaos was actually a map. But one man did. Corporal Reyes had dropped into the mud like the others, heart pounding, lungs burning with fog, until something in the pattern stopped him cold. He squinted through the haze, watching the way Lena placed the canisters, the angles she chose, the rhythm of her timing. It wasn't random. It was doctrine. His mind flashed to whispers he'd heard late at night in the barracks, stories from older veterans that sounded more like legend than fact. A young specialist who had covered a retreat alone in the desert, who had stood in the smoke while the rest of her platoon slipped away unseen. They called her Sentinel Wolf. Reyes's chest tightened as realization spread like fire. He rose to his knees, then to his feet, ignoring the shouts of an officer ordering him back down. His boots sank into the wet dirt, but his stance was firm, his spine straight. He raised his hand in a crisp salute, sharp enough to cut through the panic, and his voice rang out through the smoke with a weight that silenced everything else. "Sentinel Wolf, cover the retreat." Time seemed to freeze. The recruits nearest him stopped mid-step, their wide eyes darting from Reyes to Lena, confusion and disbelief washing over their faces. Officers turned their heads sharply, stunned by the name, some recognizing it, most not, but all of them feeling the gravity in the words. The air grew heavier, charged with something deeper than drills, deeper than simulation. Through the rolling smoke, Lena's head turned, her eyes locking on Reyes with an intensity that pinned him in place. For a heartbeat, the world was only them. The corporal saluting, the soldier standing in the smoke, and the memory neither had spoken aloud. She had been 21 the first time she heard that call sign, standing on a ridgeline under a black desert sky, her platoon pinned and broken, her commander's voice fraying over calms, pleading for a miracle. She had lit smoke after smoke, walking deeper into the haze, building a wall thick enough to buy them the minutes they needed to flee. She had felt her lungs burn, her heartbeat hammer against her ribs, but she had stayed until the last of them were gone. That night, when she stumbled back through the gray, her body trembling but alive, a corporal, different face, same uniform, had saluted her with reverence in his eyes. "Sentinel Wolf," he'd whispered. "Cover the retreat." She hadn't heard it since. Until now. Reyes's words sliced through the fog of memory and reality alike, tethering past to present. Around them, the recruits' laughter died in their throats, replaced by a stunned, unsettled silence. The officers stared, questions frozen on their lips. And Lena, quiet, steady Lena, tightened her grip on the last canister in her pack. With one smooth motion, she yanked the pin, hurled it high into the advancing line, and stood there in the thickening gray. Her shoulders rose with each calm breath, her boots rooted to the ground as the smoke swallowed her whole. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She stood as she had before, not as the smoke girl they had mocked, but as Sentinel Wolf, the soldier who carried silence like a shield and used it to save everyone else. The field was still veiled in the last wisps of smoke when the sirens cut, the exercise whistle blaring across the grounds, dragging the recruits back into silence as the officers called an end to the drill. Boots shuffled nervously in the dirt, rifles hummed slack at their sides, and not a single laugh remained in the air. They had watched Lena Harlow disappear into the gray, not stumbling, not panicking, but steady, unyielding, like the smoke itself was her natural element. Now, as the fog drifted upward into the thinning morning sky, every eye turned toward her, and for the first time, those eyes held no mockery. She stood motionless for a long moment, her face streaked with sweat, her braid plastered against her neck, her hands blackened with ash from the canisters. She looked less like the woman they dismissed, and more like someone pulled out of a history book, someone who had lived too much in too little time. No one spoke. Even Lieutenant Marlowe, who had mocked her earlier with smug jokes about being a fog machine, found his throat dry, his bravado cracked into silence he couldn't fill. Then the order came down from the command tent. Debriefing, immediately. The recruits shuffled into the hall, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor, the smell of gunpowder and burned smoke clinging to their uniforms. Lena walked at the back, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady and forward. Inside, the officers sat stiffly at a long table, folders closed in front of them, while the recruits filled the benches. Corporal Reyes sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly, his face pale but determined. The commanding officer, Colonel Dennison, cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the heavy silence. "This was not a standard exercise," he began, his voice slow, cautious, as though weighing each word against the weight of what had happened outside. He turned his gaze toward Lena. "Sergeant Harlow, what exactly was that display?" The recruits shifted, eyes flicking between the colonel and Lena, waiting to see if she would finally explain herself. But Lena, true to her nature, didn't give them the satisfaction of long words. She simply said, "Covering the retreat." The colonel's brows furrowed, his lips tightening as if frustrated by her calm, unshaken tone. "You improvised without orders," he pressed. "That maneuver wasn't in the exercise plan. And yet it worked. Perfectly." His fingers tapped on the unopened folder in front of him, a folder thicker than the others. "Do you care to explain how?" Before she could answer, Reyes rose to his feet, his voice cutting the room like a blade. "Because she's Sentinel Wolf, sir." The words fell heavy, electrifying the air. Murmurs rippled through the benches, recruits whispering, some confused, others stunned, while the officers exchanged sharp glances. Dennison froze, his gaze narrowing. Slowly, with deliberate care, he opened the thick folder in front of him. Inside, aged reports, mission logs stamped with the faded ink of classified markings, photographs yellowed at the edges, and at the very top, a commendation letter signed by a general years ago. He slid the papers forward, his voice low, almost reverent now. Specialist Lena Harlow, Operation Halberd Ridge, 2018. Under sustained enemy fire, she executed smoke coverage tactics that enabled a platoon-sized element to retreat without a single casualty. For her actions, she was awarded the Silver Star. Her call sign at the time, Sentinel Wolf. Gasps echoed across the room. The recruits sat stiff, shame burning into their faces as the stories they had laughed about came back to them like ghosts. Marlowe's jaw slackened, his eyes darting toward Lena, realizing every word he had mocked had been a weight he didn't understand. Reyes remained standing, his salute unwavering, his voice steady as he repeated, "She saved them, sir. She saved us all." Lena didn't bask in the revelation, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. She simply sat there, her hands folded neatly, her posture calm. When the murmurs finally died, she spoke, her voice quiet but strong enough to reach every corner of the hall. "I don't need you to remember my name. What matters is that when the smoke closes in, someone stands last. Someone always has to." Her words sank deeper than reprimands or lectures could have. They lingered in the silence that followed, etching themselves into the recruit's bones. The colonel closed the folder slowly, his eyes never leaving her. "Sergeant Harlow," he said firmly, "from this moment forward, your call sign is reinstated, and every soldier here will remember it." He stood, saluting her first, breaking the unspoken order of rank. One by one, the officers followed, then the recruits rose, their salutes trembling at first, then solid, as they honored the woman they had mocked, the woman who had just shown them what leadership truly looked like. Lena rose slowly, returned the salute with quiet precision, then gathered her pack. She didn't linger in the praise, didn't soak in the recognition. She simply turned toward the door, ready to return to the silence that had always been her shield. But as she stepped into the sunlight, Corporal Reyes's voice carried after her, soft but sure. "Sentinel Wolf, cover the retreat." And for the first time in years, Lena allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the kind that wasn't about victory, but about being seen, finally, for who she truly was.